Why was Liverpool the leading Arctic whaling port on the English west coast during the 18th century? This may seem a bit of a bizarre question to begin with. After all, when we think of Georgian Liverpool, we tend to think of Liverpool being a leading slave trading port. We don't think of Liverpool as being a whaling port, not by any description. So this is perhaps something completely different and enables us to think about the port of Liverpool during the 18th century in a completely different way. Before we proceed further, just one or two things I'd like to clarify here. I am talking about Arctic whaling here. Okay, so this is in the North, no, this is the North Pole. In the 18th century, there were two, well, possibly three whaling centres. We'll have to talk about that in a few minutes. But generally speaking, there were two. There was the Arctic, and then more by the very late 18th century and more for the 19th and the 20th century, we have Antarctic whaling as well. And I am talking about the 18th century here primarily. There will be a little bit here on the 19th century as well, but the vast majority of Liverpool's whaling trade, when it reached its peak, you might say, was during the 1770s. Okay, so it is primarily the 18th century. Just for a bit of background, Liverpool's whaling history, in terms of the Arctic that is, extends from roughly 1750 to 1823. Long enough, but certainly not as long as, say, Hull, Newcastle, or indeed Whitby. How did I get interested in this subject, some of you might be asking? Well, I can honestly say, and this is going back quite a few years ago, the very first VHS my parents bought for me was actually the National Geographic special on the Great Whales. So that is where my interest in whales has come from. And when I was doing my PhD, that was on Georgian Liverpool. And there was a little bit on whaling there, but since I've completed the PhD, I've got the space, as it were, to pursue this line of research with more rigor. Okay, so I'm just going to provide a little bit I just want to show a couple of pictures first of all, provide you with a little bit of background here, what the gig was essentially, and then we'll address the issue of why Liverpool was a leading whaling port at this time. So hopefully you can see a map of the Atlantic in front of you, and hopefully you'll be able to see the cursor, my cursor moving around. So obviously we have Great Britain here. Back in the 17th century, you had the Spitsbergen trade, which is, of course, to the far north of Norway. You can't actually see that on the map here. Liverpool was not associated with that trade. That was primarily on the east coast. I think Hull was associated with that. But certainly the Dutch were involved in that trade as well. Now, if we go to the 18th century, Liverpool, after 1750, was involved in whaling. Where did most of the whaling ships go to? Well, they would have left the port of Liverpool and they would have made their way over here to the east coast of Greenland, the east coast of Greenland. So down by the Denmark Strait. That is where the hunting grounds were preferred for Liverpool's whalers. There were a couple of instances going over to the Davis Strait, okay, which is on the west coast of Greenland. By all accounts, though, not many Liverpudlian whalers went there. It's very dark, it's a very dangerous journey, very dangerous voyage to get up there. And as a result, it was very costly. Now, it would seem that the East Coast whalers, places like Hull, Whitby, they did send vessels to the Davis Straits, but for Liverpool, seems to have been due to financial reasons, they were quite reticent to do that. So in the 18th century, that's where we're talking about here, the Arctic whaling trade, primarily off Greenland and a little bit here in the Davis Straits. By the end of the 18th century, the whaling trade is beginning to change its geography a little bit somewhat. So it goes, after the American War of Independence, the British whaling trade goes into the southern Atlantic, into the Southern Ocean. This is a whaling trade that will expand more in the 19th and the 20th centuries, but there are some telling pieces of evidence that it was there even by the late 18th century. Liverpool was involved in that as well. This is an area that is not particularly well recorded in the documentary record. I've only come across references to the Antarctic or the southern whaling fishery in the 18th century, only a handful of times in the context of Liverpool. But there were a few ships going down there. I couldn't say too much more about that. That would be a project for another time. I said a few moments ago also that there were three centres for whaling. There was the Arctic and there was also the southern whale fishery. Quite a few years ago, I was in the National Archives down in London, and I was conducting PhD research, and it wasn't specifically focused on whaling. Anyway, recently I've been trawling through some of my records, and very surprisingly, I found records to Liverpoolian vessels asking London for permission to sail and go whaling off the coast of Africa. Now, this may seem a bit of an odd thing. I mean, when we think of whales, we have images of humpbacks, we have images of blue whales, fin whales existing in the polar extremes. But as I'm sure many of you will know, if you've been on holiday to Madeira or to the Canary Islands, one of the big tourist industries there is to go and take the holidaymakers off the coast, and you can go and see the sperm whales and the pilot whales. I remember doing that on a family holiday quite a few years ago. So there may well actually be a third branch here to the whaling trade off the coast of Africa. From what I've seen so far, the amount of times that happened, ships leaving Liverpool for the west coast of Africa for whaling purposes anyway, would have been quite few. But that's another thing, that's another avenue of research, you might say. So, assuming then that we're concentrating primarily on the Arctic whaling trade, the northern whaling trade, you might say, what actually happened here? Well, there's not many sources. Obviously, there's no photographs of whaling vessels leaving Liverpool during the 18th century, but we do have this particular portrait, which is housed at Merseyside Maritime Museum. And this is the James. This was a French vessel, as I understand it. It must have been captured during one of the wars of the 18th century. And of course, it was captured by a Liverpool privateer, and it was converted into a whaling ship. And obviously, you can see here on the picture, it doesn't leave much to the imagination. Obviously, the ship would sail up north, as it were, going to polar regions, and they would go hunting for whales. Now, of course, it wasn't the mothership that was doing all the action per se. Obviously, a big vessel like that going through the Arctic, risking bad weather and the ice. What would happen was that the mothership, as it were, would spot the whales, spot the pod of whales, and then, of course, as you can see at the bottom of the picture, you've got these long boats, these whaling boats, and they would, separate from the mothership, and then they would go out and do the bidding, as it were. So they would, if they were successful, they would catch the whales, and of course they would bring the carcass back to the mothership, and that is, of course, where the flensing began. The animal, the carcass, was brought up on side along the ship, and of course the blubber, the bone, and various other products in the whale's body were extracted from the carcass. Those materials would then be boxed up, barreled, and then I presume the carcass would be tossed overboard, or certainly bits that were no longer necessary. Some people may argue that that is extremely wasteful. I can certainly see where they're coming from. I could see others making the case, perhaps marine biologists making the case, that the carcass drops to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And of course, this is another example of whale fall, when a whale's carcass goes to the bottom and contributes to the food chain for other animals, worms, bacteria, Greenland sharks. They would feast off all this. So that's what was happening there. As you can also see from the picture, there were various crews on board the icebergs. Okay, and there's a few more over here. They are capturing and dispatching the seals, okay, and extracting the fur from polar bears, skin from seals as well. That would also be collected, stored on board ship, and returned back to port. Once they had returned back to port, all these products, so like the whale oil, as I say, the fur, the pellets, they would also be converted into manufactured goods. You'll also notice from the picture that there are other whaling vessels here. The Arctic trade was not exclusive to Liverpool. There are quite a few instances actually of Liverpool's whaling ships going to the Arctic and perhaps working collaboratively with other whaling ships as well from Hull, London, Whitby, or wherever. Certainly there were instances when ships got lost, whaling ships got lost, and of course these other whaling ships had to come to the rescue. Okay, so we have some stats here for you. So, recently it was argued that Liverpool was actually the second English whaling port here. Now, I am talking about England primarily in this talk. I'm not really talking about Scotland. The reason for that is the records. If you want to find the number of ships that were leaving ports in Britain to go whaling, they are normally they have the totals, the annual totals, okay, for the UK as a whole. It's only in Wales and England where they break it down to individual ports. Okay, so we have individual figures here for Liverpool, that's LP on the PowerPoint. Then of course we have London, Hull, Whitby and Newcastle. You might be saying, where are the figures for Scotland? Well, you might be saying, where are the figures for the Scottish ports? That's a very interesting question. The records from the 18th century tend to lump all the figures for Scotland's whaling ports, into one category, Scotland. Okay, so the figure for Scotland can include various different ports on the west and the east Scottish ports. So I don't know from the data I've seen so far how many, whaling ships were sent, from Aberdeen or from various other places. So that's why I've concentrated primarily here on the English dimension. As I say, these are located in the UK parliamentary papers, which can be accessed online via subscription. So what you have here then are some select figures showing you how, how Liverpool was the second largest whaling port in England at certain times. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Liverpool was always the second English whaling port. I'm not saying that at all. You will notice that these figures extend from 1751 through to 1822. I've only given you a few select highlights, as it were. But generally speaking, if you look at the annual figures, Liverpool sent the second largest number of whaling ships out during the 1760s and during the late 1760s and during parts of the 1770s as well. So let's have a look at a few of these figures then. So in 1751, okay, London is the largest whaling port in England. So in 1751, London sent 22 craft out that year to go up to the Arctic. Liverpool only sends one. But believe it or not, folks, Liverpool is the second largest English whaling port for 1751, because no other port, Hull, Whitby, Newcastle, they didn't send out any whaling vessels that year. So by default, you might say, Liverpool is the second English whaling port in 1751. Now, you might say that's a bit of an anomaly. Okay, it's just one example by default. Well, there are a few other examples of Liverpool coming second. So what you have here is 1767. London is on 24. Okay, London had major assets when it came to trade. Obviously, the size of its market, the extent of its financial resources. They could pump those resources into whaling and slaving, etc., etc. Liverpool, as you can see here, 1767, is the second largest port. Okay, it exceeds Hull, it exceeds Whitby, and it exceeds Newcastle. Okay, so this is when Liverpool's whaling trade, the late 1760s, is beginning to grow appreciably. One of the high points, you might say, in terms of the size of the Liverpool fleet, comes in 1776, when the number of ships going whaling from Liverpool surges to 20. That's quite a large number for Liverpool. London is on 36, but of course, Liverpool is ahead of Hull, Whitby, and Newcastle. This has implications, I think, broader implications, for how we view the whaling trade in Britain. Gordon Jackson wrote many years ago about the East Coast being the primary focus of British whaling, and that the West Coast was essentially a sideshow. Now, as you will notice here, most of these leading whaling ports in England, okay, 4 out of the 5 are indeed on the East Coast: London, Hull, Whitby, Newcastle. But I would argue that the case of Liverpool, we don't reject the Jackson thesis that the East Coast is the dominant force. I'm not saying that at all, but it does suggest that the West Coast was actually more important than perhaps Jackson realized. Okay, so I'm not rejecting his argument, I'm slightly modifying it, saying that the West Coast in the form of Liverpool does matter more. Would anyone like to venture why Liverpool's whaling trade surges in 1776? Well, the reason for that is the American War of Independence. Prior to the American War of Independence, Britain got a lot of its whale oil from the American colonies. Obviously, they go into a state of rebellion in 1775, and in 76 they declare independence. That is too much for London to bear. So basically, there's economic retaliation against the American colonists. And as a result, London is encouraging British whaling ports to go whaling in larger numbers. Okay, and so that has a beneficial impact here on Liverpool's whaling trade. Now, not long after the American War of Independence, things go wrong for the Liverpool whaling trade. We don't need to go into the ins and outs of that now. But that is not the end of the story, you might say, for Liverpool as the second English whaling port. You'll notice that in 1794, this is just shortly after the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars, there is a major change here. In 1794, London ranks first place, but so does Hull as well. So I am being a little bit, perhaps a bit tunnel vision, you might say, but the implication here is quite remarkable. 1794, London is beginning to be overtaken by Hull as the leading whaling port. And as a result, Liverpool now ranks second. So we have a joint first, but we have a clear second, and that is Liverpool. Okay, this is significant because it shows that Liverpool is still, or can potentially still be, a key English whaling port, but also shows the change in geography on the East Coast. London traditionally had been the biggest focus for whaling. By the late 18th century, things are changing. But as you can see here, by the 1820s, things are going the other way for the Liverpool whaling trade. By the 1820s, the whaling trade for Liverpool is in the doldrums, being outcompeted by Hull, being outcompeted by Scottish whaling ports. Liverpool has other concerns. The trade to the Far East has been liberalised, you might say. So Liverpool has other aspirations there. The whale oil is less, it's not needed as much now for fuel. There was also coal gas lighting as well. So the whaling trade, especially in Liverpool, plummets by the early 19th century. So that's why I think Liverpool matters. It does matter here. But there's another way in which Liverpool matters as well. When we look at the other whaling ports, besides the big four, the big five, we will see that there are other West Coast whaling ports here. So you've got Liverpool. You can see this on the PowerPoint. Liverpool, Bristol, Dartmouth, Exeter, Milford and Wales, and of course, Whitehaven. Now, the thing that strikes me here, and I'm sure strikes many of you as well, is that Liverpool appears to have been the leading whaling port on the West Coast. Okay, for a large, for a large section of this time. So 1751, you will recall, going back to the previous slide, that Liverpool was was the second whaling port, as it were, because only London and Liverpool were whaling that year. So by default, once again, Liverpool is a leading whaling port. The 1750s, Bristol does try and get involved in whaling, and it is level pegging with Liverpool in terms of the annual number of vessels departing. But thereafter, folks, Liverpool is still the leading whaling port on the English West Coast. So 1760, the figures for Bristol have dropped. Exeter, Milford, they aren't involved anymore. I think we can take that as an indication as to the threat posed by the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. It really damaged the whaling trade. But Liverpool somehow manages to hold its own. And as we go later into the 1760s, the 1770s, the 1780s, Liverpool continues to be the leading whaling port on the west coast of England. So 1776, Liverpool is sailed 20 craft. Exeter, a leading port during this time. Dartmouth, Milford, they are far behind, okay? And it continues to be the case in the 1780s as well. So I would argue then, and I'm going to speed up here, in some ways, Liverpool is the second whaling port in England at this time, or part of that time. And certainly, Liverpool is the leading West Coast port in England for the Arctic whaling trade. So you might say, why is this the case? Okay, why was Liverpool the leading Arctic whaling port on the English West Coast during the 18th century? I would argue that there's quite a few strengths here for Liverpool. One of which is capitalization and support. As I'm sure you know, Liverpool has many, in the 18th century, had many leading merchant firms, big firms that are involved in different types of overseas trade. So the Tarletons, okay, there's Tarleton Street in Liverpool City Centre, Hardman Street, certainly. They were some of the early participants, you might say, in Liverpool. John Tarleton, John Hardman, to the best of my knowledge, did not actually go whaling, but they certainly invested in the whaling enterprise. Okay, so the first whaling vessel that went out from Liverpool in 1750, the Golden Lion, Tarleton and Hardman invested in it. Okay, quite generous amounts of money as well. So if you go to Gomer Williams' History of Liverpool Privateers, you will find the figures for how much they invested in there. Thomas Staniforth, another leading merchant in Liverpool at this time, he only really becomes involved in the 1770s. But there is money being pumped into this, folks. Okay. It should be pointed out here that in the 18th century, it's quite common for different ports to form companies that specialised in whaling. So there is the Newcastle Whaling Company, which was established, the 1750s, I think. That doesn't happen in Liverpool for some reason. Instead, they operate on a system whereby individual companies like the Toltons, the Hardmans, the Staniforts, they are involved in whaling. There is no Liverpool Whaling Company. Quite why? Probably have to do some more research there. So there is there's evidence that the whaling trade is being financially supported. Part of the reason for this, I think, is that the whaling trade actually does provide financial rewards for Liverpool. I have some, what are the products? Well, certainly the whale oil, okay, is extracted from the spermaceti of whales and the blubber. That is stored on board the whaling ships and then turned into whale oil. The blubber is turned into whale oil. There was a oil refinery by Greenland Street, surprise, surprise, near to the Albert Dock today. Apparently the smell was rather pungent. People at the time writing about this, very unpleasant, as I'm sure you can imagine. So that was the whale oil. We also have, as I say, the furs of Arctic animals, the polar bears, the seals. That was manufactured into clothing. Okay, so that was produced in Liverpool. We do actually have some figures that have survived on the value of these goods. So the Nicholson family, they were a big merchant firm in the 1750s and the 1760s. In their correspondence, this is dating from the 1760s, this is, the price of camwood in Liverpool was valued at roughly £32 per tonne. Oil from Wales was valued at £21 per tonne. This is less than the camwood, admittedly, but kelp was also sold in Liverpool for the princely sum of £4 per tonne. So certainly the whale oil is more valuable than some other commodities. There's also another reason why whale oil is valuable in Liverpool at this time. This is the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And the Northwest region is arguably the first industrial region in England. So if Liverpool can provide the whale oil, that's going to help to lubricate the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. There's another reason why I think the Liverpool whaling trade does pretty well during this period. And that is because the whaling industry is supported by its members of Parliament. We've got to remember that what happens at sea does matter, but what happens on land also matters as well. Are you going to get the support from your members of Parliament to back your trade? So a little bit of background. At this time, there's only one parliamentary constituency for Liverpool, but somewhat differently in the unreformed Parliament prior to the Great Reform Act. The constituencies consist of 2 members. It's a bit like your local council wards today, where you live in a ward, but you have 3 councillors, or certainly in the metropolitan authorities anyway. So at this time, you have one constituency for Liverpool, and there are 2 MPs, Sir William Meredith and Richard Pennant. Now, both of these men are very interesting characters. I could talk about them at great length, but we don't have the time. Suffice to say, Richard Pennant was, he was an absentee landlord in Jamaica. He resided in Liverpool, but his family had tremendous estates and a very large number of slaves in the West Indies. So the Pennants had they were very interested in transatlantic trade, and whaling was another string to their bow. To the best of my knowledge, Pennant never actually invested in whaling voyages, but he certainly supported the whaling industry in Parliament. Sir William Meredith, he was a very lively member of Parliament. That's a concise way of describing it. But as a member of a expanding mercantile centre, he was certainly very interested in supporting the whaling trade. So what did these merchants actually do? What did these members of Parliament actually do? Well, they wrote petitions with the merchants supporting the whaling trade. They were very active in extending the bounty. Now, the bounty was a figure that was levied by Parliament. It was essentially a financial reward, an incentive. If you brought back so much produce from whaling, your ship would be paid a bounty. And the merchants in Liverpool were very keen to see this extended, as you can imagine, because the bounty only existed for about 2 or 3 years. Then it had to come up to renewal and renewal again. Pennant and Meredith, they presented the petitions from the merchants. They were involved in drafting the legislation that even extended the bounty, and they reported from various parliamentary commissions and committees into the whaling bounty. So they're very, very active here. Another reason why Liverpool becomes a leading Arctic whaling port on England's west coast is indeed because of the American War of Independence. As I said, Britain imports a lot of its whale oil from the colonies at this time. That destination is effectively closed after 1775 because of the War of Independence. So English ports are very much, they spy an opportunity and they jump on it. Arguably, Liverpool is best placed, however, to take advantage of this on the west coast, simply because Liverpool, and we are talking about the English ports here, Liverpool has the largest transatlantic trade on the west coast of the English ports during this period. So as a result, I suppose, if the American market is closed, Liverpool has the greatest incentive to go whaling, as it were. The East Coast ports like Hull and Whitby also take advantage of this opportunity, but their Atlantic trade was never as great as Liverpool. As I'm sure you know, most of their trade was with, coastal trade, mainland Europe, and also the Baltic. So we can see now why Liverpool is why Liverpool should be a leading whaling port on the English west coast. And that is the area where I've done most of my research. This is the area that is a work in progress. So if Liverpool was the largest English whaling port at this time, well, what were the other whaling ports doing? Okay, why didn't they take advantage of this to the same extent that Liverpool did? So I've done a little bit of reading, and if any of you have any possible insights into this, I'm not saying that any of you remember that time. Obviously, I'm not saying that at all. But research that you conducted, you might be able to pass something on. So Bristol was a major port in the 18th century. Why didn't Bristol, buy into whaling more? Well, it did in the 1750s through to the early 1760s. It was involved in whaling. But the explanation that I've come across by some of the literature on this subject is that the Bristolian merchants were not particularly adventurous. They knew that they were making their money from, transatlantic slavery and sugar. So why bother venturing into another trade, whaling, that was only seasonal, essentially? So perhaps they were being a little bit conservative, you might say, with a small c, in terms of their business interests. Exeter. Now, Exeter is, it's a lovely place. I've been there, and it does have a harbour, but I think we'd agree it's not as large as Liverpool's. Exeter did dabble in whaling at different times from the 1750s through to the 1780s, but compared to Liverpool, it was somewhat limited. Why? One explanation I've come across is that because Exeter was based on the south coast of England, its trade was primarily coastal, possibly linked to America, and also linked to continental Europe. It was a little bit further away than what Liverpool was. I'm not entirely convinced about this myself. If you can send a vessel from Liverpool up to the Arctic, I'm sure Exeter could have done as well. There are some other explanations here. That the docking facilities in Exeter were not as great. They couldn't accommodate the whaling ships. Again, I'm not too convinced about that explanation myself. Hull, which was on the East Coast, was very heavily involved in whaling, had been involved in whaling in the 17th century in the way that Liverpool wasn't. But they didn't get a dock until the 1770s, I think, so I'm not too bothered about that. Perhaps the reason why Exeter didn't dabble in whaling that much was simply because, whaling is it's a very treacherous occupation. They did lose quite a few vessels going to the Arctic, and they simply said, we've had enough, move on to other areas. Whitehaven did actually become involved in whaling. Whitehaven's tobacco trade was weakened by competition, as I understand it, from Glasgow. So in the 18th century, they did dabble in whaling, but it didn't go that far. Quite a few of the Whitehaven whaling vessels were sunk by ice, bad weather conditions. And the outputs, you might say, the catches were quite, they weren't particularly good, and they fluctuated a lot. And perhaps also Whitehaven didn't have the industrial hinterland that, say, Liverpool did. So Liverpool could outcompete Whitehaven when it came to the products from whaling. And as a result, we do know that mariners from Whitehaven who did go whaling, eventually they just decided to leave Cumbria and come to Liverpool. Okay, so they moved elsewhere. The one that I'm really interested in is the Isle of Man here. So far, I've not found any references to whaling from the Isle of Man. But as I say, my research is in the early stages here. Certainly, the Isle of Man had, was closely attached to, the Irish Sea, smuggling, trading at Liverpool, the coastal trade, also being involved in the transatlantic slave trade as well. So why didn't the Isle of Man engage in whaling? I think part of the reason for that might be, I'm not 100% convinced yet, but we'll have to wait and see, is that the Isle of Man, up until the 1980s, was involved in basking shark fishing. Now, basking sharks have very large livers and they're very oily, okay? So if you want oil, you don't need to go to the Arctic Sea and get it in Wales. You can just stay around the Isle of Man and get basking sharks and extract the oil that way, okay? I do not know, though, when the Isle of Man began basking shark hunting. It certainly lasted up until the 1980s, okay? So that's an area of research. Now, I'm coming up to the end of time here, because I suspect there might be one or two questions. I think there's a very important consideration here, which links Liverpool as the second English whaling port for certain years, and the fact that Liverpool seems to have been the largest whaling port on the English west coast. We've seen that Bristol, Exeter, Whitehaven were not really involved in the whaling trade. As a result, I think this opened, it provided Liverpool with an avenue, an opportunity, you might say, to become the leading whaling port on the English west coast. And as a result, that enabled Liverpool to challenge Hull, Whitby, Newcastle, to become the second largest English whaling port, admittedly for only a few years. That's basically all I have to say. Basically, arguably, Liverpool was the second largest whaling port in England and arguably the largest whaling port on the English west coast. Thank you.